Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel on creating publishing opportunities for emerging writers. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're on today, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded in so-called Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge that because this is a virtual panel, people will be watching from all over the world, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands from which people are zooming in from. We're going to have a chat today about creating publishing opportunities for emerging writers with an exploration of the dynamics between writer, editor, and publisher, where all parties are considered early or emerging. My name is Brooke Maddison, and I'm a writer and editor living in Brisbane, Australia. My nonfiction writing has been published in Kill Your Darlings, Antithesis, Verity La, and Spineless Wonders. And I'm the recipient of a mentorship with the University of Queensland Press, who I'll be working with on a nonfiction manuscript. My pronouns are she, her, and my visual description is a white woman with dark brown hair, wearing a black and white striped t-shirt and a black pinafore, and I'm sitting in front of a white brick wall. So I'd now like to call on our other wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. Ren, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Koszarycz. I'm a copywriter. I'm also a postgraduate writing, editing and publishing student. I work on Turrbal and Yagara land. My pronouns are she, her. And my visual description is that I am a fair-skinned woman with short, dark brown hair and glasses. I'm wearing a colourful pastel short sleeve shirt, and I have a white wall in the background.
Thanks, Ren. Good to have you here today. Rani, would you be able to introduce yourself to everyone, please?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rani. I am a Wiradjuri and Indian writer writing in Brisbane on Turrbal, Yagara and Yugambeh land. I write anything, really, and
Oops, Rani, I've just gone on to mute.
I just finished my postgraduate studies for writing, editing, and publishing. And yeah. And my visual description is that I am a tan person with wearing a linen button-down shirt with short, dark hair, and there are bookshelves in the background. My pronouns are she, they.
Thanks, Rani. Great to have you here. Wolfram, would you be able to introduce yourself now to everyone?
Sure. Mine's a little bit more formal. My name is Wolfram. I use they, them pronouns. I have a background in community welfare, events management, and publishing, contributing to events like Brisbane Writers Festival, Brisbane Queer Film Festival, the Zine and Indie Comic Symposium, Festival of the Photocopier, and the Wendy Bird. I freelance for local street mags, Fruity Magazine and Q News, curate a zine publication called Queer Content, Comics and Zines, and teach workshops on developing writing, editing, and publishing skills through zines. I'm here because my first short story, Heartstring, was published in the premier Crackle anthology of creative writing through UQ's teaching press, Corella. A physical description, I am a toe of a human, white boy with a strappy shirt and a colorful background.
Thanks, Wolfram. It's great to have you here today. Last but not least, Jerath, would you be able to introduce yourself to everyone, please?
Sure thing. My name is Jerath Head. I am a writer, editor, and sometimes publisher from Brisbane, Australia. More particularly, I live and work on Yagara, Turrbal, and Yugambeh lands. I've been working in the publishing industry in some various capacity for about 10 years now, and my nonfiction writing has been published in a number of journals in Australia and sort of street press magazines and arts and culture publications here and in Ireland, where I lived for a couple of years. My pronouns are he and him, and I am white-skinned with dark brown hair. I have a short beard. I'm wearing a light beige shirt, sitting in front of a white wall with a very dark stand-up piano in the background.
Lovely. It's great to have you here today. To start our discussion off, I'd like to ask Ren if she could explain in a little more detail what has brought us together as panelists today.
Yeah, so yeah, it's awesome to be here. Thank you so much. So the five of us are all either students or graduates of the Writing, Editing and Publishing program at the University of Queensland. And more specifically, we all contribute in some shape or form to a new anthology of creative writing called Crackle. So Jerath, Rani and Wolfram, 3 of our 16 featured writers, and Brooke, you and I were the editors.
That's it. Yeah. So the anthology has recently come out. Ren, would you be able to speak a little bit more about how we came about to be creating the anthology at the university?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of our sort of initial intentions was that we wanted to create a way for early and emerging writers to support other early and emerging writers. So the journal itself was sort of born out of a few recurring thoughts that were running around in our minds, I think, as well as a few really, really fortunate circumstances. So I guess just speaking about that, so Brooke, your writing had just been accepted into Jacaranda, which is an academic and creative writing journal that's been going for some time at UQ as well. And we were fans for other university anthologies rather. So sort of Antithesis and Verge were 2 anthologies that we were reading and we're really inspired by. So we also had this cohort of incredibly talented writers sort of in front of us who, I suppose, like everyone here today, were on the lookout for new pathways to publication. And we were also fortunate enough to, we have a teaching press that runs out of UQ that's sort of used for our course called Corella Press. And so we pitched our anthology to some really fantastic people who sort of supported us through the project. And the initial pitch was that we would get a variety of short fiction and nonfiction pieces and put them together into this one anthology for our course. So I guess we're really, really fortunate in that sense as well that we had Corella Press to be able to support that project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Ren. So while, of course, as Ren has said, the anthology is something that all of us contributed for, we also all create and work on individual projects that could be considered emerging or self-published. So Jerath, I'd like to start with you first. Can you tell us about the kinds of emerging or self-published projects that you've been working on recently and what drew you to creating them in the first place?
Sure thing. Recently I've been taking a little foray into the world of zines, which I don't think I have nearly as much experience as Wolfram, and I'm sure Wolfram can give a lot more insight into what it takes to produce a zine. But a friend of mine and I decided last year that we would have a go at producing a zine back when the lockdown started, and we thought it would be a shame to not be able to see the people that we are used to seeing in the publishing industry in Australia, and to work together in a way that sort of these things kind of come about just by being around places and seeing each other. And so we made a real pointed effort to reach out to a bunch of writers and a bunch of visual artists that we knew and wanted to just sort of get them all together on something. And yeah, it took a while because things get in the way when you're doing things on your own steam, as everyone will know. But we eventually published it late last year, and then we enjoyed it so much that we decided to do another one with a similar premise, which was getting a bunch of writers that we knew and pairing them this time with visual art from around Brisbane. And the point of both scenes was really to kind of get emerging artists in, and not just emerging, there were some more established writers that we published as well, get them in kind of a conversation with visual art around the city, either that was already here or from artists that we knew, and also partly to have emerging writers in the same publication with more established ones that we knew as well.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that. So were they, the writers and the artists, were they all, you were calling on people that you knew personally or had worked with before?
Yeah, more or less. We sort of, I mean, obviously my partner in doing the zines, Jonathan O'Brien, and I have been in Brisbane in the publishing industry for a while, so we had to limit the amount of people we were reaching out to, but it was mostly just people that we knew of who either had published or were looking for opportunities to work together with other people. It ended up being, a bit of a mix of more established people, and then people that we knew had also worked in the industry and had aspirations to publish, but maybe weren't as active about pursuing it, or sort of just hadn't had the opportunity as much.
Okay, and then what was the editorial or the publishing process like in putting it together once you'd asked people if they'd like to contribute and they'd said yes? Was it quite a extensive editorial process, or?
It was for a couple of people, I think, probably tending towards the more emerging writers, largely because I think they wanted the more feedback, and because the first thing we didn't pay anyone, the second one we paid an honorarium. It was very little. I think more established writers sort of will write a piece but probably won't want to be engaging in too much feedback given that, but for an emerging writer it's often more of a developmental thing, and myself was more at that stage. So I've been working as an editor for some time, and my partner in the zine is also a relatively well-regarded writer and editor in his own right, and so I think there was that opportunity for it to be a bit more developmental for the emerging writers.
Okay. Fantastic. Thanks for that. Wolfram, what about yourself? Can you tell us about some of the other projects you've been working on recently? What drives you to create them as well? Would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, so I guess coming from a low socioeconomic background, growing up in a foster home, you don't really have the opportunities to succeed. You can't really afford success the way a lot of other people can around you. And that can be quite disheartening for someone who wants to enter the world of writing or publishing, particularly comic artists in Brisbane. We've got a huge collection of comic artists. So I got involved with a little festival called the Zine Indie Comic Symposium. And I guess our ethos was making that space accessible to people who really didn't have the resources. And we've had a lot of huge success in that. I've worked with Festival of the Photocopier as well. We've seen authors like, Alison Evans, Claire Coleman, Shastra Dio move from the zine space into large publishing. Alison Evans, I think, has 6 books under their name now, which is fantastic. Shastra Dio is about to publish her 3rd book, which is wild. So that's the kind of thing that I've been working on. Outside of that, I've been doing workshops that are teaching people about the writing, editing, and publishing process, and using zines to kind of test those skills, practice those skills. Because with zines, it really is, it's the same level of work as mainstream publishing, but I guess because you're in control with its distribution, how people receive it, and how people are allowed to interpret it to some extent, the rewards are more manageable. It is a more manageable process for a lot of writers who don't really have the financial backing to make such a large risk, which publishing can sometimes be.
Thanks for that, Wolfram. That's really interesting to hear from that kind of perspective. Thanks for sharing that with us. Yes, Jerath, have you got something you want to add to what Wolfram's just said?
Yeah, just that wanted to add to Wolfram's comment about the resource intensive nature of it. It's something that we found making the zines as well, printing on a university printer and buying a $50 stapler from Amazon and just doing all of the work to produce it, largely because we didn't have the capital and we just wanted to make something. And then the lack of resource is something that we found. It really made the process more immediate. It's something that's really valuable, I think, in making those publications.
Yeah. Yes, Wolfram.
Yeah, well, now because you know me, I have the resources, so I can share those with you for future. Make me staple some zines for you.
That's lovely. This is what it's all about. Creating new opportunities for publication. Rani, what about you? We'd really love to hear what kind of projects you've been working on lately and some of the inspiration behind what you've been working on.
Yeah, so I mean, the project that I just finished up was my dissertation. So that, I think that took up, I did it over a year, so it took up most of my time, and I was working throughout that in the School of Music at UQ, doing some other stuff. But my dissertation was on world building and concept albums, and sort of specifically how we build worlds that dissolve the dichotomy between reality and fantasy, how we make these sort of magical worlds, and what techniques we use to do that. And I was particularly sort of interested in that as a deaf writer, because I have always sort of been really interested in how we convey sound in writing, but then how we use writing and sound together to create worlds. At the moment, I've started reworking a novel idea that was developed in, I think, a web course where either Brooke, you, or Ren was like in my group to give feedback or something. And it's sort of around that same sort of idea that conveying of sound or the lack thereof for a deaf character, and how they come back into the world experiencing sounds that they haven't heard before, and how that can be sort of confronting, and learning to take breaks from sound. That's something that I have access to that not a lot of people do. And it's also something that you wouldn't necessarily always think of when you're reading. It's very sort of this visual idea, which is probably why I like it so much, as it's a very visual thing. You're reading and it's coming to life in your head. You don't have to hear anything. So that's sort of what I've been doing. And then outside of that, I've been reviewing video games for a long time on Z Games, 4ZZZ. That's sort of like the thing that I do. We try to create a space for local, like Brisbane game developers, and try to give them a platform to sort of have their games reviewed and spoken about and given to the however many people listen to our show. I think it's a big number. And that sort of thing. So it all kind of folds back in on itself. I'm doing lots of things all of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, because you also have a blog that you've been running for quite a long time.
Yeah, so I've kept my author website, my blog, since I was in high school. On the suggestion of a teacher or something, that if I wanted to be a writer, that's what I should have that, and I need to go from that. And I was very lucky to have been gifted my domain by a family member when I didn't have money, because I was a teenager and I didn't work. So they paid for my domain so that I could have access to that. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. And that's really good, solid advice from a high school teacher. Yeah, kind of looking back, I wish that I would have started a bit earlier. Yeah, that's good advice for anyone, because we're going to be sharing some advice towards the end of the panel. So I think, Rani, you've got in there and shared something quite good already. I'm keen to know now how each of you feel about how emerging writers, editors, and publishers can work together to create new opportunities for publication. I mean, we've already started to touch on this when we've just been speaking about projects that we're working on individually. But if we could chat a little bit more about that. So firstly, Jerath, how do you think editors can go about creating new opportunities in publishing spaces for emerging writers?
Emerging editors in particular, or more generally?
No, editors in general, but emerging writers in particular. Yeah.
I think it's something that, there's a few different ways that come to mind. One of them is people taking initiative to do projects that sort of sit outside what is traditional publishing. I guess in Australia, there's a relatively narrow band of places that people can go to sort of seek quote unquote recognized publication. And there's so much potential. Of course, it's hard, as we spoke about before, without resource backing, but so just experimenting with publication, if people are willing to put the work in and to put the time in and to try and find things. One of the zines that we produced, we just found out the other day that one of the writers who has not got a publishing record really to speak of, but prior to this, she published sort of, well, sorry, let me rephrase that. She doesn't have that sort of literary journal kind of publishing house, publishing record, but has published some sort of journalism and stuff in various places. But she got picked up by Koszarycz, which is a literary journal that publishes predominantly poetry, and ended up being asked to make a chapbook on the basis of the piece that she'd written for the zine that we did. So those opportunities, while they're not, you can't always expect them to happen, they can happen, and they're really great when they do happen. And as Wolfram was saying, using those platforms that people can then step through to other opportunities. But I think in my work from a more established publication, I've found that there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done. People have a lot of good intentions for publishing emerging writers that often fall by the wayside under the constraints of page length, the need for marketing plans that involve big names, the fact that print has a certain prestige that everyone will always gear towards putting a more established writer in a print thing, and yet because it has that prestige, it's really important for emerging authors as well. So I think that's a big one, is sort of maintain that advocacy and being aware of how it is really easy for it to fall away. At a more industry level, I think this is probably getting out of the bounds of what we're talking about, but I feel like there's a bit of a shortfall in funding as well for emerging writers. There are specific things, but a lot of the big funding amounts go to well-established things, or they don't take risks on projects that encourage people to really try different things and experiment. So I think that's it's sort of not in the hands of editors, but I think that is a real issue as well.
Yeah. Well, the hands of editors and publishers, but then you're even going wider than that and looking outside the scope. But that's some really kind of key things for people to be thinking about. Wolfram, I'm wondering if you'd like to talk about this a little bit more in relation to zines and your role as a creator and editor, in particular of queer zines. So how do you see yourself creating new opportunities for publication for not just any emerging writer, but also for queer writers in particular?
Yeah, so I put a lot of notes about our responsibilities as consumers of media, and in the context of books, where it's readers. But if we look across all versions of media, whether that's podcasts, listeners of podcasts, viewers of TV shows, we are all consumers of media, and we have a responsibility to talk about the media that we enjoy, that enriches our lives. Particularly as queer people, everyone is obsessed with RuPaul's Drag Race, and for a lot of queer people, I know that's their only reference to queerness. I never really got into RuPaul's Drag Race because I know RuPaul in a historical context, and I couldn't bridge that. I couldn't justify watching and contributing to that as a viewer. Particularly when you have TV shows like Legendary, which is run by the ballroom community in benefit of the ballroom community. So being active in your consumerism is definitely the first thing for any writer, editor, or publisher. Acknowledging the power that you have in this space, because people are going to be looking at you and watching you and what you're interacting with. And if you're interacting with what everyone else is interacting with, then you're just contributing to the same thing. But if you're contributing to independent film creators, independent writers, zine publishers, comic creators, and you are talking about them, other people will talk about them too. You are in a position as a writer, editor, or publisher who has established themselves to lift other people up with you. Does that answer your question?
It does. It's a really great point. I really like the direction you've taken that. It makes me think of Rani as well, talking about the games that you're reviewing, Rani, on your show and radio and podcasts.
Absolutely.
And it just really adds that. Yes, Wolfram?
Yeah, I love Rani's show quite immensely. It's been the platform for people like Jack Kujanin, B Bravo to go off and be amazing people.
Very cool. Yeah. I was wondering if anyone else has anything they'd like to add kind of about, we've already spoken about it a bit, but DIY and digital modes of storytelling and how they can create opportunities for writers who may otherwise have been shut out of more traditional publication spaces. Wolfram? We got anything you'd
sorry,
like to...
we have some notes. Yeah, sorry, bit of a delay there. So yeah, we did establish the Young and Emerging Publishers Network, which is what we used to launch Corella. We double dipped with a bit of funding to get that happening, which was useful. Yeah. But also, you know, we got to talk to people like Alex Adset and Kim Wilkins, but also some local zine producers of Ibis Magazine, and then there was the Tundish Review, and on all levels, there was always the understanding that these things were achievable, and that a lot of writers really needed to start thinking about independent publishing and how they could take control of how their story was managed. I think definitely something we saw at the end of COVID, particularly in the end of 2020, when a lot of writers and editors were kind of rushed to complete projects. And then a lot of those projects didn't do so well because publishers weren't putting in the marketing, necessary marketing. And then those authors in turn did not receive as much for their following books because their previous books had underperformed. And so what we saw at the beginning of 2021 was a boom in independent publishing, authors taking control, seeking out smaller publishing houses rather than the larger ones, because of this process that they had been mismanaged in an effort to kind of like retain the sales that they'd lost because of COVID.
I mean, I think that kind of leads quite nicely to a broader discussion of the intersection between opportunity and who has access to publishing spaces and our roles and responsibilities as editors and publishers, especially with regards to supporting more diversity and inclusion. So Ren, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of our experiences as first-time editors of Crackle, the creative writing anthology, and in particular, what we've learned in that first year as editors.
Yeah. So look, Brooke, the major learning there, I think, for myself, and then obviously in the discussions that we've had together, is that there's just so much more to learn. I think, you know, listening to communities is just super, super important, and also just taking more proactive steps to actually, I think, creating spaces where there is more access. So I guess with regards to Crackle, because so much of what we were doing was really new to us, we sort of looked at what other publications were doing in terms of access and supporting writers with diverse, you know, backgrounds and identities and experiences. Particularly when we were calling for submissions. And yeah, moving forward, that's just not enough. I think not because the publications that we looked to weren't themselves doing enough, but because we could only really see and therefore sort of emulate what was happening on the surface. And I just think that in terms of engagement, it just needs to be a lot more meaningful.
Yeah, and I guess like Ren and I have also spoken a fair bit about when we set out, you know, our intention with Crackle was to kind of create an anthology of recently graduated or current students at the University of Queensland in Australia, but then kind of having a recognition of the access that people who are doing the course, the privilege of someone already being able to do a Masters of Writing, and which voices are not there and so therefore are not going to be represented. And really, whilst we are creating this with the university support, we can widen the scope of what we want to publish. So Ren, do you want to speak a little bit more about some of the ways we're thinking of doing that for next year?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think there are ways that we can kind of address those limitations and I think open up Crackle as a publication. So I guess within the university, kind of opening submissions up to different writing courses that aren't just necessarily writing, editing and publishing is one way to address it. But then I guess also looking outside of the university to organisations. I guess, for example, a brilliant First Nations project that comes to mind is Black and Right, which kind of supports First Nations writing and editing in Queensland out of the State Library of Queensland. So I suppose asking organisations like that if they are interested in being involved, but at the same time with complete respect to the fact that they're going to have their own initiatives that they'll be focusing on. So yeah, I think it's just about kind of trying to get that engagement going at all parts of the publication process. So from the absolute get-go of the project through to the selection panel, through to the editing process. Yeah, I suppose rather than just sort of paying lip service, I suppose, to access and to inclusion. Yeah. And that kind of needs to be something I think that needs to be continually reviewed. It's not a set and forget kind of a situation. Yeah.
Absolutely, and you don't need to be boxed in as by the limitations of this is what we thought we were setting out to do. For example, on this project when we did the first one, doesn't mean that we can't now change it going forward. Jerath, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking something that came to mind as everyone's been talking was an anecdote that I wanted to quickly share that I think ties a few threads together. Which was when I was working at a more established publication that was a university-based organization that sort of reflects to giving opportunities for more diverse voices and more, but also to like the use of digital, the use of a more established platform to engage with less established platforms. It was about around the time of the marriage equality plebiscite that we had in Australia, and there was a bunch of negative noise being directed towards people in Western Sydney as a result of the vote. And I'd been trying to work for some time with the publication to establish a working relationship with a group called Sweatshop, who run out of Western Sydney, who published some amazing stuff, really great writers coming out of Sweatshop. And because we were sort of trying to figure out if we could use the print journal, what we could do online, and then this opportunity arose when I've been maintaining this relationship with the editor for a little while, trying to figure out what we could do. And then this moment came up where I was talking with my editor, so into that editor, and we ended up deciding to do a short series. It was 5 pieces a week, just giving writers from Western Sydney the opportunity to talk to their experience. There wasn't a real necessarily direct link with the outcome of the marriage equality plebiscite, but there was a really nice opportunity both to leverage the capacity that we had at that journal at the time to engage people and to do it in a way that was timely and reactive. And I think that, so part of what I'm saying, I guess, is that the responsibility of editors is largely to be reactive in the way they're producing content, and digital platforms are a good way to give people voice when they need it or when it's more timely, but also it's important to keep maintaining those things behind the scenes, which I think is a bit of what you and Rani were just talking about.
Yeah, Wolfram, have you got anything you'd like to add to that? It was a really interesting anecdote that Jerath shared.
Yeah, I think particularly post-COVID, the process of marketing has really been amalgamated into other roles. So it's really become the responsibility of the author themselves, but also the editor and I guess people they know, bookshops. The publisher is taking less responsibility in marketing their books. And as editors ourselves of this beautiful anthology, I guess we have a responsibility to kind of look at how we're reaching people with this book, how we're making this book visible to our target audience, because our large publishing houses aren't taking responsibility for that anymore.
Yeah, take it into our own hands. Thanks for that, Wolfram. Rani, as you're coming on board as another co-editor of Crackle for next year, which we're really excited about, I'm wondering if you've got any points or that you'd like to see changed going forward in relation to making space for more voices in Crackle. Oh, and you're just on mute at the moment.
Yeah, so my Zoom has just decided not to show me any of those details. So I don't actually know if I'm on mute or not.
Okay. That's cool. We got it sorted. We'll tell you.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's sort of an interesting way of going about it, because I'm running into sort of the same issue with sort of a recording label, how we go about representing those voices and making sure that they are there, because it's a fine line between asking somebody to identify and then also making sure that they're not lying about it. You like to think that people wouldn't do that, but people have done that in the past. And then, yeah, like understanding that some people aren't coming from a space where they've had access to those things. So, you know, I'm deaf, and I have a lot of deaf friends who they didn't go through mainstream school. They didn't have access to writing the same way we might have had access to writing, or maybe they didn't grow up in, you know, a socioeconomic situation that allowed them to have that time or that freedom, or the barriers that disability sort of gives you. So then maybe they haven't made it through undergrad. Maybe they didn't even get into undergrad. They might not have finished high school, but they're still writers. They're still poets. They're still telling stories. They're just doing it their way. And, you know, some of them do it sort of visually. Auslan has this beautiful visual storytelling. And then some of them want to write it because it's, you know, in some ways writing is the most accessible, but it isn't in a lot of ways. So it's sort of making sure there's that. And I think there are lots of ways we can go about it, but I also think it depends on sort of specifically what we want to do with the anthology, and the voices that we really sort of want to grab from our communities and want to highlight from our communities. And that might change year to year. So it's really gonna fall to that, I think. But it'll be about, I think it always comes back to calling on communities. So, you know, you called on our web community, you know, that's where the call went out to first. And our web community is diverse, but it's not necessarily the most diverse, because it does have this many hurdles that our students had to jump to get there in the first place. And there are so many writers that didn't make it over some of those hurdles that are just as spectacular, but there are other things that are sort of getting in the way. So it's about, now that you have these people that have contributed, that are coming from those wider communities, you know, it's about using each other and helping each other to call on those communities to widen that net.
Yeah, thanks, Rani. I think that's a really beautiful way of speaking about it, and that, yeah, calling on communities and then continually widening the net moving forward. And I think at the heart of it is you then need to make sure that any publishing space that you're creating has people's safety at heart. So yes, you're not just paying lip service. So if you're asking people to contribute their work, especially when we have already mentioned a little bit kind of DIY self-publishing modes where contributors are not being paid or not being paid much, you need to really make sure that the process is safe for them to share their work. The editorial process affirms them and makes all the contributors feel safe as well. I'm wondering if anyone would like to talk about the nature of our roles and responsibilities as emerging editors and publishers with regards to representation and own voice narratives, especially in relation to nonfiction writing. So how it kind of differs when you might be editing nonfiction in particular. Rani, would you be able to speak to that?
Yeah, so that's like a sort of really, really important thing, especially for me being somebody who would be, you know, an own voices writer if I'm writing a character who's deaf, or I'm writing about, you know, an experience that I've had in my life, because I do sort of tend more to fiction than nonfiction. But I think the first step and the biggest step in that is making sure that the voice that you have chosen is an authentic voice. And that sort of is where some people sort of I've seen, like in the past, they worry about asking about that. they worry about that they're stepping on toes by asking. You know, if I were to tick a box in a submission that says, do you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? And I say, yes, I identify as Aboriginal. Anybody could accidentally click a box like that. And it's sort of, some people feel uncomfortable asking, oh, well, you know, who's your mob? What country do you come from? Or can you tell me a little bit more about that background? Because they feel like it's inappropriate. And there is a line where it becomes inappropriate. But I can very easily tell you who my mob are and what country I come from. And the same way I can sort of very easily, in the same way that I can very easily tell you that I'm Indian, and the same way that I can very easily tell you that I'm deaf. And I work sort of in the film and television industry as well as an actor. And that one is sort of different. You have agents sort of really crossing boundaries that I think would maybe be considered inappropriate outside of that field, where they're really badgering you about, oh, well, you know, how deaf are you? Those sorts of things where it doesn't matter how deaf I am. The only people that need to know how deaf I am are my doctors, so that they can assess what amount of assistive technology I need. And even then they don't. You know, my OT was just like, no, we'll get you the smoke alarms that flash or whatever. So it's about making sure that the voices are authentic and knowing where that line is. And most of the time that line is really sort of, if you think that it might be a step too far, then it could be, but you can also preface it by asking, you know, are you comfortable answering this question? And if it's not relevant, let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's like working with, if you don't have somebody that's in that position as an editor, like say I wasn't there and we had a deaf contributor and you wanted to know something, or an Indigenous contributor and you wanted to know something. Usually I would say that it's important to have somebody in that sort of higher role, in the editor role, where they have a similar background, and they have that sort of similar knowledge base, because there's a comfortability with that. It is that level of representation in that step above, where, you know, I would feel more comfortable going to a publication that's run by Indigenous people or by deaf people than than a publication that's run by all white guys. Like, I would feel very nervous going for that. And making sure that we have authentic voices is the most important thing as well. I've read so many articles about reviews on like movies that have wheelchair users in them, and the language used is inappropriate, because they'll be saying something like wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair, and that language is inappropriate. And it's something that you would only know as an editor if you actively made sure that you knew what terms should have been used.
Yes.
And also if you'd had that sort of lived experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just kind of conscious of time as we go forward. So, but it's just such an interesting discussion. I can see that Jerath and I think Wolfram have got something to add to this. So I might call on you, Jerath, first, then Wolfram, and then we'll kind of move into our last part of the panel today. So Jerath, have you got something you'd like to add to
just
Rani's?
Quickly, I think that's a really great point that Rani's raised, and from an editorial perspective, at least in my experience, and I think it applies more generally, it's really easy, especially dealing with a writer who's lived experience. When you're dealing with nonfiction, it might be separate to yours. When you're editing, especially if you're editing a lot of stuff in a short space of time, it's very easy to put editor hat on and just start pushing through and working on things. And I think one of the easiest things to do is to step back when you're facing something and go, hang on, something about this that doesn't fit with my, assuming that it's outside of my experience as an editor or as a writer or as a person, something about this isn't fitting with my sort of editorial hat, and I need to step back and take just a lighter touch. Obviously, there's so much I don't understand here, and it's becomes much more about asking questions and less about making changes and making suggestions. And then even just on really minor things, like I think, you know, we've all been through similar study. There are certain things that you're taught to, as an editor, to do, like italicize words that aren't, you know, used in it. Like, who cares? Sometimes you just get rid of it. It doesn't matter. But it's really easy to get fixated on those small things and go, oh no, it's the style guide. I got to do it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Wolfram, have you got something you wanted to add to this discussion as well?
Yeah, you know, queer folk, more than any other minority group, really develop their concept of identity through interactions with media, because we don't really learn about these things in high school or from our parents or from our peers. We learn it from what we read, what we see on TV, the heroes that we make for ourselves through interactions with media. So the line between fiction and nonfiction is very thin for us. You know, as Ursula K. Le Guin says, there are things you can say in genre fiction that you can't in nonfiction about the real world. And for queer people, that's definitely the case. We learn about what it means to have healthy relationships and you know, sex through our interactions with media. So you know, supporting Rani's comments, you really need to be engaging with those people to understand what's working, what's not working. These days, I guess my big peeve is that we kind of normalize a lot of female writers who, when you look at their work, it is quite fetishizing of the gay male experience. In a long history, quite a long history of like BL manga, which is quite violent and quite toxic relatiunder a lot of those folk, I think we've normalized that particular aspect on the guise of, well, you know, gay people don't really own these experiences, but we definitely do, and we definitely learn things through these books. We learn how to be through these books. Yeah, so backing up Rani's comment, you really need to engage with those people to understand where they're coming from and what they need.
Yeah, I think this is all just such a great kind of topic to discuss, and I'm sure we could all talk about it for hours because there's so many nuances and really important things to say. So thank you all for contributing to that part of the discussion. But we've got about 5-10 minutes left. So I'm wondering if we would like to share some important kind of must-knows that are worth us sharing as emerging creators, or some of us more established, so either as a writer, an editor, a publisher. So I've got a couple of areas I'm going to call on people to talk about first, and we can finish off with some final top tips. Rani, would you like to start us off? How do you go about achieving balance between work and carving out time for creativity in your life? And you're a very creative person who does a lot of different creative modes. So yeah, how do you go about achieving that balance?
It's hard. I have a lot that I'm balancing because I have a lot of medical appointments as well. It is hard. It's hard, but I do it because I love it. And I had to set a boundary for myself as well. Like, I had to tell myself, you know, if I've had a hard day, I've had lots of appointments in a week, it's fine if I don't write. It's fine if I don't make music. It's fine if I don't even play a video game. Like, you know, through my dissertation, I wasn't doing those things. It was just my dissertation. I couldn't even read because that was taking everything. And that was fine. Like, it's learning that boundary for yourself and learning how to forgive yourself for that. You know, if I need to get up at 4 a.m., which I have done, to write, because I just have to get it done, because it's better for my mental well-being to write, then I will. Then I will make it happen.
You'll make it happen, yeah.
Yeah, it is that case of like, you will make it happen. And if you think that you don't have the time for it, and you feel like you don't have the time for it, and you don't feel up for it, and you don't want to do it, don't. Yeah. There's no point in forcing yourself.
Yeah, and I guess that's really kind of key. I like even using the language of setting boundaries with yourself, and it's okay to take a break, but then not letting that break, however long that period might be, of stopping whatever creative process you're doing, become a hurdle to starting again. Jerath, would you be able to talk a little bit about what developing a writing routine looks like for you?
Would that I was a more efficient writer in terms of the way I structured my attempts, but I mean, the thing that I've slowly learned is to just make this space for it. It's really easy, especially, I mean, Rani can probably test this better than most of us. Actually, probably everyone here. It's a really easy thing to have a writing project that you want to work on and then take on a whole bunch of other stuff because it's more immediate, or because you get the reward out of doing something like making a zine, or like, you know, doing this kind of stuff. It all crowds out, and it's really hard to claw out that time. But it's really essential to have, you know, sometimes if it's all you can fit, as Rani said, then you got to do it in a sprint here and there. But the more you can create the space around everything, within everything else you're doing, the more effective it's going to be, and the better it feels too. Honestly, like when I've got a good practice going, it feels way better to write than it does when I'm having to force it out between other jobs, other tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've definitely had that experience and trying to create space for it all. Ren, what about you? How important would you say your creative partnerships are for you when it comes to writing or writing projects, larger writing projects you've been working on?
Look, in terms of creative partnerships, I think, I mean, I sort of, you know, I tend to write sort of as a partner of an art direction, as the partner of an art director in my day-to-day life as an advertising writer. But I think what I've really valued in terms of partnership is probably having that editing partnership. I think, Brooke, particularly with you and I on Crackle, I think we tended to really sort of complement one another. So I think, yeah, the partnership there was just super important to be able to kind of, I guess, just divide, but also look at work through different lenses as well. And yeah, I think that's the main thing there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just adding on from what you've said, Ren, we have had a couple of little aside from our work together on Crackle, Ren and I have had a couple of little writing retreats this year with other writers that we know, you know, very informal, but just go away for a long weekend and kind of inspiring each other to sit down and do the creative writing and do the work. And so that's been like a really lovely part of having a writing community. Wolfram, have you got any tips about how you yourself go about finding publishing opportunities as a freelancer? Or would you, Wolfram, be able to speak about how it's been for you as a freelancer over these past year or so?
Yeah, so as a freelancer, working mostly, because most freelancing writing gigs are about entertainment, and obviously everything in entertainment is kind of dried up a little bit. But working in community, doing a little bit of community writing has been keeping me afloat for a little bit. You really have to be a little bit shameless when you're a freelancer. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there. If someone rejects one of your stories, ask them why. Don't be afraid, because if they don't want you to be writing for them, it's, you know, you're not going to get them anyway. So most big street press particularly, they don't really talk to each other. So if you annoy one, you're not annoying all of them. So feel free to be shameless, put yourself out there, hit opportunities.
Yeah, I really like that as a tip. Ask them why. I don't know if I've ever done that, but I did just get something that I'd submitted to a literary journal, like quite a small kind of one that's recently started up in Australia, and I got you know, a rejection back, you know, not this time, but also saying, if you want any notes, let us know and we'll tell you why. And it's just having that, like, it is such a good opportunity to take that, but I haven't taken it yet. But I think after you've said that, I will, and just say, yeah, any tips on why this wasn't quite the right fit. I think for myself, like one of my biggest yeah, just do it. Just do it. Well, I mean, usually I love getting feedback. I don't have an issue with, getting feedback, and the more critical it is, the better, in terms of like, this is something that needs to be tightened up, or work on this, or, this bit isn't quite working. I love it because it's just helping you with the process of writing. I think for myself personally, one of my biggest tips in terms of finding publishing opportunities is to sign up to every single newsletter you can find, writing centers, publications that you like. Obviously, reading publications that you're a fan of, but then also getting on the newsletters, because they will send out their call outs, competitions from other places. They'll often have, I'm talking about in an Australian context, but I've also seen this internationally as well. And although I am not a very organized writer in terms of structure or plot, my writing tends to be a bit all over the place, and then I kind of work out how it goes. I am very organized in terms of planning what I'm going to pitch to and what I'm going to send out to. And Ren has seen my spreadsheet. And
I was going to say, I've seen your spreadsheet.
Yeah, with my tracking spreadsheet and how I keep track of everything. If something gets rejected somewhere, then I'll just send it to the next place. And yeah. Wolfram, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, like just backing up, don't be afraid to make small projects, because I think that's what's brought a lot of us here. Rani, you left notes about how your submission to Crackle you're working on at the moment. And Jerath, you and I have done zines. They're going to be something bigger one day, I assume. Certainly for me and many of the zines we've seen, a lot of the authors that started with zines. So don't be like anyone who's starting out with editing or publishing. Don't be afraid to start those small projects and just do it. And then you have something out there as an example of your work that you can work on later.
Yeah, fantastic. I love it. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to call on everyone to just like say their final tip or add on to what we've just been talking about, because I think we've just got so many valuable things to say. So Jerath, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce the point that Wolfram just made. I think that writing for publication is such a big goal that everyone wants to aspire towards, but you got to be comfortable writing for yourself to a degree, and knowing that a bunch of stuff it's fine. You hear a lot of established authors talking about stuff that sat in the drawer for however long. I think that a lot of people don't get enough advice on doing that these days, and we don't think enough about it. It's fine for stuff to sit in the drawer. It's fine for things to be very small in their aspirations. I think that's one of the biggest and hardest things that I've had to learn over the years.
Oh, great. Thank you for sharing that with us. Ren, what about you? What's your kind of final top tip or parting words you'd like to share?
So in this context, I'm definitely an early writer. So I suppose in terms of submitting to magazines or pitching to various journals, just know the publication really, really well. Read their guides and basically everything that's available on their websites, and also just know the publication well.
Yeah, because there's a whole wealth of resources that publications will often have, pitching guides, style guides, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's a really good tip to look to that. Rani, what about you? What are your final words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us all?
Mine would actually be to get another hobby. Not because don't write, but because you're not going to write something worth reading unless you're doing something different. It might be why I do 10 million things, but you need something to do when you need to walk away from a piece that isn't working for you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a really great perspective. I've heard other people say that as well, but yeah, it's really, really important, I think. Wolfram, what about you? What would you like to share with us?
All right, go to those events. Be intentional about your relationships with people around you. And thirdly, be kind to yourself when you just don't have the energy to do that.
Yeah, well, fantastic words, I think, to end up on. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I hope this has been an interesting discussion, and has got you thinking about our roles and responsibilities as editors and writers, and that some of those kind of tips that the group has shared at the end are helpful to people out there in Zoom land across the world. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Jerath, Rani, Ran, and Wolfram, and to Alex for the behind the scenes tech support. Thanks so much to Nonfiction Now for providing this wonderful opportunity for us and everyone else involved in the conference to share our ideas. I hope that everyone enjoys their discussions over the next few days, and thank you once again for joining us. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you.